Every single night, when the world grows quiet around 2 in the morning, millions of glowing screens light up faces that are frozen in silent exhaustion and panic. The latest data reveals that overwhelming anxiety has quietly become the most widespread mental health crisis of our entire modern generation. Why does the most frequently shared piece of spiritual comfort in human history so often fail to bring relief to the very hearts that are breaking for it? Is it possible that we have spent centuries simply repeating an ancient phrase like a routine formula without ever truly understanding the deep psychological mechanism of how it heals us? There is a very specific verse found at the Holy Scriptures that well-meaning people have offered to anxious souls for generations. You see it printed on millions of morning coffee mugs, stitched into decorative living room pillows, and sent in hurried text messages by loving friends who honestly just do not know what else to say to ease your pain. Yet, for the vast majority of heavy hearts who receive these words, the message can feel completely hollow and empty. This disconnect does not happen because the sacred text is broken, nor does it mean that the Almighty has somehow forgotten your name or your struggles. It happens simply because almost no one has taken the time to truly explain what those ancient words were meant to accomplish. Nobody ever paints the real picture of what the Apostle Paul was actually experiencing when he wrote those profound lines from a cold, dark prison cell in ancient Rome. Hardly anyone has ever unpacked the profound psychological and spiritual machinery operating underneath the text that can turn these words from a superficial platitude into a genuine, lasting cure. Today, we are going to change that narrative completely. By the time we finish this journey together, you are going to understand Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 in a deeply personal way that you have likely never experienced before. You will discover not just what the text says, but exactly what it does, how it functions within your mind, and why long-standing anxiety does not have the right to write the final chapter of your life story. But before we can fully unlock this ancient solution, we have to sit down and deeply understand the true nature of the problem we are facing. Because anxiety is rarely the simple thing that most people assume it to be. If you misdiagnose the root cause of your internal psychological pain, every single human remedy you attempt will inevitably fall short of giving you rest. When you strip everything else away, anxiety at its most fundamental level is just your tired brain trying to solve an entirely unsolvable problem. Your mind locks onto a painful uncertainty in your future, like a fragile relationship, an unexpected medical diagnosis, a volatile financial situation, or perhaps a grown child who is not where you hoped they would be by this stage in life. Your intellect completely fixates on that specific unknown and immediately begins running endless, exhausting calculations in the background. You constantly ask yourself, what will happen if this worst case scenario occurs, or how you will find the strength to survive if that specific disaster strikes your home. Those draining mental calculations never truly stop because the future can never provide the absolute ironclad certainty that your brain requires to feel safe and at peace. As a direct result of this cycle, you lie awake in the pitch dark of night while your chest tightens into a heavy, painful knot. The exact thought you tried so desperately to push away all day long surfaces at the worst possible moment during a quiet car ride home, or in that fragile space between waking and sleeping when you have absolutely no defenses left to fight it. Let me share a deeply moving and true story with you about a woman named Elena. Elena had been a deeply committed and faithful believer for more than 20 years of her life. She knew her scriptures thoroughly inside and out, led a warm, small group study in her living room on Wednesday nights, served her community selflessly, and poured her heart out in prayer every single morning. Yet, despite her profound devotion and love for God, she suffered from an anxiety so utterly crippling that on some days, she literally could not find the strength to step outside her own front door. This heartbreaking struggle did not occur because her personal faith was weak or because she was not trying hard enough to find a sense of peace. It happened because the well-meaning people in her life continually handed her the exact same generic spiritual prescription over and over again. They constantly told her to just trust God a little bit more, to pray significantly harder, to believe bigger, and to simply memorize Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. They pointed directly to the words that tell us not to be anxious about anything, as if she could simply flip a mental switch and instantly stop her deep psychological suffering. There is something so quietly devastating and lonely about being commanded to stop feeling an emotion that you have absolutely no conscious control over in the moment. That kind of advice never produces genuine peace, but instead creates an overwhelming, suffocating sense of personal shame. And shame piled directly on top of severe anxiety forms one of the heaviest and most painful psychological burdens a human being can possibly carry through life. So let us take a moment to actually look at this famous passage slowly and carefully, rather than just skimming over the surface like we usually do. The definitive answer to our panic is fully present within the text, but it has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul writes that we should not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving. We must present our request to God. Then he adds that the beautiful peace of God, which completely transcends all human understanding, will guard our vulnerable hearts and our anxious minds in Christ Jesus. Unfortunately, most readers focus entirely on those very first 4 words of the instruction and completely stop processing the beautiful depth of the rest. They interpret the phrase as a rigid legal prohibition, as if Paul is a strict police officer issuing you a legal ticket for the crime of worrying. But that rigid interpretation completely misrepresents the true loving heart of the author. Remember that Paul was not sitting in a comfortable, quiet office when he composed these profound sentences. He was writing from a miserable, dark prison cell, having already survived being beaten, shipwrecked, stoned, abandoned, and deeply betrayed by his closest friends. He understood human suffering and isolation at a raw, visceral level that most of us will thankfully never have to approach in our lifetimes. So, he was definitely not dismissing the heavy reality of your anxiety from a comfortable position of detached ease. He was speaking directly from the turbulent other side of panic, sharing a beautiful state of deeply discovered peace. He was handing his readers the exact psychological and spiritual map he used to navigate his own intense internal darkness. The core command here is not for you to magically eliminate every single feeling of anxiety from your physical body. The true instruction is to execute a very specific, gentle action instead of letting the panic consume your entire day. If you look closely at the actual structure of the verse, you will notice a crucial transition where he says, "Do not be anxious about anything," but that single 3-letter word changes absolutely everything for a hurting soul. Paul is not telling you to simply push down or suppress the anxiety, but is instructing you to purposefully redirect its immense nervous energy. He is showing you exactly where to place that heavy mental processing power that anxiety wants to waste spinning in endless cognitive circles. He tells us that in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, we must present our requests to God. 3 specific words buried deeply inside that practical instruction alter the entire dynamic, and those words are with thanksgiving. He does not tell you to pray desperately, nor does he say to pray frantically or storm the gates of heaven demanding an immediate cosmic fix to your problems. He instructs us to pray with thanksgiving, which is a concept that has deeply confused generations of hurting people over the years. How can a person possibly express genuine thanksgiving when their entire life appears to be falling apart right in front of their eyes? How do you manufacture gratitude when a medical diagnosis is terrifying, when a long marriage is broken, or when a prodigal child refuses to come back home? Here is exactly what Paul truly means. And this is where the spiritual mechanism clicks perfectly and beautifully into place. Thanksgiving is not some artificial emotion that you must forcefully manufacture in your tired subconscious mind. It is a deliberate, courageous declaration of what you already know to be historically true about God, completely independent of your current painful circumstances. When Paul instructs us to pray with thanksgiving, he is telling us to approach God with our shared history rather than just our immediate, overwhelming problems. We must arrive with the vivid memory of every single time comfort, strength, or quiet resolution arrived in our past. We must bring the concrete record of his faithfulness to mind, however imperfect our human remembrance might be at the time. We must speak with complete honesty, telling God that we are frightened, overwhelmed, and deeply confused, but that we still remember exactly who he is to us. That specific transition of thought is entirely transformative for the weary human psyche. It does not instantly erase the physical sensation of fear in your chest, but it immediately places that fear into a much larger and safer context. It places your temporary anxiety inside a grander and older narrative that does not conclude with your absolute worst case scenario. We can see this exact psychological and spiritual strategy operating all throughout the ancient text of the Psalms. Those raw, completely unfiltered prayers read far less like formal religious devotionals and much more like a person experiencing a genuine mental breakdown in the dark. In Psalm 77, the writer Asaph opens his prayer with one of the most painfully honest confessions in all of Holy Scripture. He states openly that he cried out to God for help, begging with tears to be heard in his deep distress. He mentions that at night, he stretched out untiring hands toward heaven, but his soul completely refused to be comforted by standard words. He was so intensely troubled that he could not sleep, could not even find words to speak, and felt his spirit slipping into total black despair. This certainly does not sound like the description of a composed religious individual who has all of his emotions perfectly managed. However, when we reach verse 10, a profound cognitive shift suddenly occurs deep within his mind. Asaph begins to purposefully and intentionally remember the past. He completely stops staring exclusively at his current pain and starts asking himself what God has actually done in the previous generations of his family. He forces his focus onto objective historical facts rather than the volatile, painful emotions he is experiencing in the present moment. He declares aloud that he will actively remember the ancient deeds and beautiful miracles of the Lord. He states clearly that he will meditate deeply on all the the mighty works that occurred long ago in times of old. In doing so, Asaph literally preaches deep truth to his own fractured soul. He interrupts the destructive anxiety spiral, not by denying his real pain, but by intentionally introducing a competing truth that is more powerful. This is the exact mature form of thanksgiving that Paul is describing to us. It is not a state of forced artificial happiness, but a quiet act of deliberate, disciplined remembrance. Anxiety lies to you so effectively because it forces your mind to focus solely on the immediate problem and the imagined future catastrophe. It completely hides the secure anchor of your life while forcing you to stare directly at the terrifying height of the storm waves. True thanksgiving breaks that cruel illusion by forcing your eyes back onto the stable anchor. Now let us analyze the extraordinary psychological and emotional payoff that arrives in verse 7. Paul promises that the peace of God, which transcends all human understanding, will actively guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It is absolutely vital for us to notice that the text does not promise that your external problem will be instantly solved tomorrow morning. It does not say that the medical test will automatically come back clean or that the financial disaster you fear will definitely be avoided. It simply states very clearly that the peace of God will actively guard your vulnerable heart and your weary mind. The original Greek word that ancient translators render as guard is actually a strict military term. It literally means to stand watch, to garrison a whole city, or to post heavily armed soldiers at a fortress gate. Paul is describing the peace of God as a vigilant, protective, standing army stationed directly at the entrance of your inner life. This protective army keeps constant watch so that sudden panic cannot breach the fragile walls of your mind and heart. Furthermore, Paul notes that this unique peace completely transcends all human logic and understanding. This means that a moment will eventually arrive in your life where your difficult circumstances have not changed one single bit. The complex problem is still sitting there. The uncertainty remains completely real. And yet, you inexplicably find yourself breathing deeply and normally again. You will suddenly realize that your soul is being held perfectly secure right in the middle of the chaos. This does not occur because the external storm miraculously stopped, but because something far more powerful has steadied your internal world within it. Let me share another true and comforting account of a man named James. James was a highly successful surgeon who was naturally meticulous, detail-oriented, and entirely reliant on his own personal control. His entire professional identity and sense of security were built upon knowing exactly what would happen next during a complex life-saving operation. Everything completely shattered when his youngest son was suddenly diagnosed with a terrifying and life-threatening illness. For the very first time in his entire adult life, James found himself trapped in a scenario that he could not surgically operate his way out of. He could not research his way to absolute certainty, nor could he simply work harder to fix the heartbreaking situation. He approached his trusted pastor in a state of absolute desperation, completely unsure of how to handle the heavy anxiety that had moved into his chest like an unwanted hostile tenant. Fortunately, his pastor did not give him a shallow platitude or tell him to simply stop worrying about his child. Instead, the pastor looked at him and asked James a deeply profound and completely unexpected question. He asked James to recall a single time in his 47 years of life when he was absolutely convinced God had abandoned him, and it turned out he was actually correct. James sat in complete stunned silence with that question for a very long time. He mentally searched through his entire past, but simply could not think of a single instance where he was left entirely alone to suffer. He realized there had been dozens of difficult moments where it certainly felt like he was abandoned, but looking back, every single one of those trials contained some form of unexpected grace. That single conversation did not instantly cure his beloved young son of the heavy illness. The medical journey that followed was incredibly long, exceptionally difficult, and filled with frequent moments of intense human fear. However, James later confessed that something fundamental within his internal posture had shifted permanently that day. He completely stopped trying to see the entire length of the dark road ahead and simply started walking one single day at a time. He kept his eyes focused calmly on the one who could see much further into the future than he ever could. That is a beautiful and vivid example of Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 being practically lived out in real life. At this specific point, we must directly address a critical truth that is often dangerously ignored in religious communities. If we fail to acknowledge this heavy reality, this entire conversation will feel dismissive to a significant portion of you watching today. The truth is that some forms of severe anxiety are deeply clinical in nature. Certain painful struggles are rooted in complex brain chemistry, severe psychological trauma, and physical realities that absolutely require professional medical care. There is no single Bible verse, no matter how profoundly true or spiritually powerful it is, that was ever intended to serve as a substitute for legitimate clinical treatment. God is the ultimate source of wisdom who gave humanity the gift of modern medicine, the expertise of kind therapists, and the complex science of the human mind. Utilizing those professional resources is never a failure of your personal faith, but is rather an act of profound and mature wisdom. It represents responsible, loving stewardship of the intricate body and mind that God uniquely granted to you. The wisdom offered in Philippians chapter 4 is never meant to be a replacement for professional clinical care. It is the beautiful spiritual truth that you bring into the counseling room right alongside that medical care. It functions as a deep, steady foundation of psychological security that can hold you up while you do the exhausting work of emotional healing. The profound peace of God and the practical help of a trained counselor are never in competition with one another. They are intended to walk together as supportive companions on your personal journey toward wholeness. Let us return to the text one more time to notice another beautiful hidden detail embedded within verse 6 that most readers miss entirely. Paul writes that we must bring our requests to God in absolutely everything. He heavily emphasizes that word everything, meaning we should not restrict our prayers only to massive life or death crises. That single word matters immensely because anxiety possesses a remarkable ability to scale its intensity over time. It always begins by targeting the major serious crises of your life. However, once panic becomes comfortable dwelling inside your mind, it begins attaching itself to increasingly smaller daily issues. It starts making you lose precious sleep over heavy afternoon traffic, an awkward text message that went unanswered in an upcoming business meeting, or an embarrassing comment you made 3 weeks ago. Paul's timeless instruction covers every single one of those scenarios completely without exception. There is absolutely no category of human worry that is deemed too trivial or small to bring before a loving God. There is no prayer too mundane, no fear too embarrassing, and no anxiety too too small to be worthy of his absolute attention. When the text says in everything, it means the highly specific named concrete worry that is keeping you wide awake tonight. It means moving far past a generic prayer, like asking God to just ease your vague sense of anxiety. Instead, it means explicitly telling him that you are terrified of a specific event happening, that you cannot stop obsessing over it, and that you desperately need him in that exact painful space. This deep level of psychological specificity matters immensely because a vague prayer almost always results in a vague, temporary sense of peace. Conversely, a prayer that courageously names the fear drags the monster straight out of the dark subconscious and into the clear light of day. A powerful healing shift occurs within your brain chemistry when you articulate your specific fear out loud to God, rather than chewing on it endlessly in your own mind. Modern psychologists refer to this exact internal process as cognitive reappraisal. Ancient Christians simply referred to it as honest, heartfelt prayer, but the underlying psychological mechanism is completely identical. To maintain total honesty with you, we must also look closely at what Paul does not promise in this famous passage. He never promises that the specific scenario you fear will magically be prevented from happening in this life. He does not guarantee that every single one of your personal prayers will be answered in the exact manner you desire. He never promises a comfortable, easy life that is entirely devoid of painful storms and losses. What he explicitly and beautifully promises is an unshakable, loving presence residing directly inside the storm with you. He promises a deep internal peace that does not require perfect external circumstances to exist at all. He promises that you are deeply cared for by a God who is never surprised or overwhelmed by the heavy situations that completely paralyze you. There is a powerful and familiar narrative in the Gospels that perfectly illustrates this dynamic for us. Jesus and his disciples were inside a small wooden fishing boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. A sudden, violent squall arose, causing massive waves to crash over the sides of the boat until it was nearly sinking into the dark water. The disciples were highly experienced sailors, yet they were completely terrified for their lives, while Jesus slept peacefully in the back of the boat. They woke him up in a total panic, asking if he even cared that they were all about to drown. Jesus stood up, spoke directly to the howling wind and crashing waves, and the storm instantly ceased entirely. He then turned calmly to his disciples and asked why they were so afraid and if they still lacked faith. If you tear that verse out of its context, it can sound like a harsh scolding that dismisses their very real physical danger. However, look very closely at the true order of what actually occurred that night. He did not simply tell them to stop feeling afraid while the water was filling the boat. He actively addressed the external danger by being right there in the storm alongside them and eventually calming it. It is vital to realize that he was resting inside the boat the entire time the storm was raging around them. He was fully present in the midst of the danger before he ever chose to alter the external weather. He did not wait for perfect calm conditions before deciding to accompany them on their journey across the water. That is the exact foundational promise underpinning Philippians chapter 4. God may not always immediately dissolve the external source of your panic, but he is always sitting right there in the boat with you. The peace he provides is fully accessible in the absolute middle of the crisis, not just when you finally reach the safety of the other side. Now let us look at a highly practical exercise that you can easily implement tonight or tomorrow morning when anxiety begins to rise. The ancient prayer that Paul outlines has a very specific and beautiful structural anatomy. When you pray it intentionally by following his exact model, a noticeable shift occurs in your tired mind. You must always begin your prayer with a moment of thanksgiving. Before you even mention your urgent requests, name 3 concrete things you know to be absolutely true about God's character. Do not focus on things that feel true in the emotional heat of the moment, but focus strictly on facts you objectively know from your past. Remind yourself that he has been faithful, that he has never truly abandoned you in your past, and that he is not limited by human constraints. Anchor your mind firmly in those historical realities before you proceed any further. Next, you must name your specific fear with absolute raw human honesty. Speak it out loud into the quiet room if you are able to do so. Tell God exactly what you are afraid of without using cleaned up religious language or hiding your actual worst case scenario. Lay completely bare the exact disaster that your imagination keeps replaying on an endless, exhausting loop. Give that heavy fear a definitive name and hand it over to him completely. Finally, you must intentionally release your control over the outcome. This is undoubtedly the most difficult step of the entire process for any of us. Speak words stating that you do not know how this situation will resolve, but that you choose to trust his greater loving perspective. Tell him plainly that you are laying the heavy burden down and leaving it entirely in his hands. Once you say those words, you must consciously force yourself to stop calculating. Do not immediately pick the worry right back up and begin running the stressful equations all over again. Give the beautiful peace of God a physical moment to arrive in your quiet space. It is rarely instantaneous or loud, but it will surely come to you. For many people, it arrives in the quiet hours of the night when they suddenly realize their physical breathing has slowed down. They notice that the tight grip on their chest has loosened because they are simply no longer carrying the massive weight all by themselves. Let us return one final time to the inspiring story of Elenia. Through the combination of an excellent professional therapist and a completely restructured prayer life, she slowly found her way forward. She completely stopped viewing prayer as a rigid religious performance or a checklist duty. Instead, it became a raw, specific, and deeply grateful conversation with a present, loving companion. She confessed later that her transformation was not a dramatic lightning bolt moment of instant healing. It felt much more like slowly learning how to breathe, using the full capacity of her lungs after long years of taking shallow, anxious breaths. Philippians chapter 4, verse 7 promises us that the peace of God will actively guard your heart and your mind. Elena stated that it felt exactly like having a protective sentinel watching the doorway of her soul. The terrifying panic attacks no longer possessed total, unrestricted access to her inner mind. A resilient psychological buffer had been established between the rising fear and her true core identity. It was not a perfect or completely finished journey, but it was profoundly and beautifully real. This is the ultimate truth that I want to leave you with today. Anxiety always tells your mind a very specific and convincing story. It constantly tells you that the disastrous outcome you fear is highly likely to happen. It tells you that you're entirely incapable of surviving the deep pain if it ever arrives. It claims that God is either completely oblivious to your private suffering or simply unwilling to help you up. It insists with a loud voice that your present fear is the absolute truest reality of your entire life. But every single one of those terrifying claims is an absolute lie. The true biblical strategy for overcoming anxiety is never emotional suppression or forced positive thinking. It is a total, gentle reorientation of your entire self toward a creator who is infinitely larger than the object of your greatest fear. It is a specific, honest, and deeply grateful conversation where you willingly lay down what you cannot control. And when you do this, the promised peace will inevitably arrive in your heart. It will transcend your human intellect because it is not generated by your own analytical mind. You are never too anxious or too broken for this ancient promise to work in your life. Your personal situation is not too complicated, and your deep fear is never too large for him to handle. Remember that Paul wrote these eternal words from a dark prison cell while wearing heavy iron chains on his wrists. He was facing a high-stakes trial that could easily conclude with his public execution at any moment. Yet, he wrote about peace not as some distant future hope, but as a tangible, present reality in the worst circumstances imaginable. If that supernatural peace could reach Paul inside a Roman dungeon, it can easily reach you exactly where you are sitting today. So bring it all to him without holding one single thing back. Give him the deep fear you have been far too embarrassed to ever say out loud to another human being. Hand over the worst case scenario that you keep rehearsing in your mind at 3 a.m. Bring it with complete honesty, deep gratitude, and specific naming, and then let the peace of God do exactly what it promises to do. Let it guard the door of your mind and heart. This is not a shallow platitude or a meaningless verse to be stitched onto a throw pillow. This is an ironclad eternal promise from the God who stood up in the boat during the height of the violent storm. He is resting in your boat right now, and he has not once in all of human history abandoned a single soul who came to him with their fear. Do not be anxious about anything. There is a safe place to put your weight, and there is a loving Father waiting to take it away from you. The peace that follows is far greater than anything you could ever produce on your own. Start there and let the rest naturally follow.